Jesus was frequently on the move. After the death of John the Baptist and the rising opposition to him, he withdrawn somewhat from the Jewish society in Judea and Galilee, going into Gentile territory, Tyre and Sidon, and on the east of the Sea of Galilee. He then returned to Capernaum for a while, but his focus was on preparing his disciples for what lay ahead. They knew he was the Christ, but they didn't understand that the Christ must die and rise again. And so he told them, "Do not tell anybody that I'm the Christ," because the people at large don't understand what is going to happen either. In Mark chapter 10 we read, "Then he arose from there and came to the region of Judea by the other side of the Jordan, and multitudes gathered to him again, and as he was accustomed, he taught them again. The Pharisees came and asked him, 'Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?' testing him. And he answered and said to them, 'What did Moses command you?' They said, 'Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her.' And Jesus answered and said to them, 'Because of the hardness of your heart he wrote you this precept. But from the beginning of creation God made them male and female. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate.' In the house his disciples also asked him again about this matter. So he said to them, 'Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if a woman divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery.'" My name's Arthur, and I thank you for joining me as we share together from Mark chapter 10, verses 1 to 12. We find Jesus returns to the east of the Jordan, but up opposite Judea, closer to Jerusalem, and people come from all around to come and hear him speak. The crowds again gather around him, and with the crowds come the Pharisees, testing him. They're wanting to make Jesus sound unreasonable and unfair and find fault with him. And so they bring a thorny social issue, which has always been an issue in a fallen society. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? This passage is very relevant to our current situation in Australia, because marriage has been under attack for the last 30 years, with easy divorce and people not getting married at all, but being treated as if they were married. We are faced with the situation of marriages that break down. When relationships break down, there really is no easy solution. But the consequence of easy divorce has just meant less effort being made to maintain marriages. So we find in the Old Testament that there was provision made in the law of Moses for divorce. And so the Pharisees had picked up on this, some arguing a man has the right to divorce his wife. And in Matthew's version of it, we have for any reason. It's his prerogative. He can discard her whenever he wants. But if he does so, he must give her a formal divorce, a written certificate, so that she's free to marry another. Now, this was what Moses wrote in the law, but that's not the underlying principle, Jesus says. The underlying principle is what was said at the beginning. The fact that provision is made for failure doesn't mean that we should therefore aim at failure. We should aim at what God's original purpose and intention is. And that is plainly stated in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, and is the foundation of society, pagan and Christian, around the world, throughout history. The relationship between a man and woman, as husband and wife, was established before sin came into the world, before there were problems in relationships between people. It is part of God's plan for life on earth. So, from the beginning of creation, Jesus says, God made them male and female. Just as an aside, God made them male and female on day 6 of creation. The woman was specifically prepared to be a wife for Adam. So this was a foundational relationship. There wasn't any other relationship existing before then. And it was said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This also from Genesis chapter 2. defining the continuation of families. A child is born and grows up, then he leaves his parents' family to establish his own family with his own wife, and the two are regarded as one. And what Jesus says is, so then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate. God has planned that the two people should live together as one family unit. And that is God's purpose, and therefore that should be our goal and our aim. Now, we understand that there are failures in relationships. In the New Testament, Paul also makes provision that a person might separate from the one that they're married to in extreme circumstances, because life is no longer tolerable. It's dangerous. But the teaching in 1 Corinthians 7 concerning people who are married is that if a believer separates from their spouse, they must remain single in hope of reconciliation. But if the unbeliever separates and marries, then the believer is free also to remarry. God made no other provision for a family. There is just this single provision, this goal of a man and a woman coming together as one flesh, and that is God's simple plan. Different societies and cultures have various ways of recognising marriages and strengthening and supporting marriages, and Western society is now in a mess because government has got involved, taking over the registration of marriages from churches. It's now made its own rules concerning divorce, and some are pressuring to change the very definition of what a marriage is. And so the disciples quiz Jesus about this matter. He points out to them a very simple truth. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. In other words, to divorce somebody so that you can marry somebody else is breaking the commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. The idea that the Pharisees had was a man, if he didn't like his wife, could divorce her and go and find someone who was better. And in Australian society, a person just needs to move out for 12 months and then the government will give them a divorce, and then they're free to marry somebody else. But God defined marriage, God created marriage, and God defends marriage. Jesus said no, because there's a commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. And if you divorce your wife and marry another, you're committing adultery against your wife. And if a woman divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. In other words, it is possible for people to separate. But if they do separate, they are to remain separate, unmarried, not to remarry, while ever their former spouse is alive and remains unmarried also. Of course, when one person is dead, then the other is free. This poses a question, though, because Jesus clearly puts the focus on the person who is doing the divorcing, the person who is giving up on the relationship. If you feel you must give up on the relationship, you cannot marry somebody else. But what about the person who is divorced? When I was a young man, a scandal arose in the church. There was a young married couple. The husband was too busy to teach his wife to drive and sent her off to a driving school. She had an affair with the driving instructor and eventually divorced her husband and married him and had children by him. The issue then was, could the husband, who had been divorced by his wife, who of course is not without fault in the situation, marry again? Some said no, because he's committing adultery against his wife. But she's already committed adultery against him. And the law of Moses forbids them remarrying in this situation. My conclusion from 1 Corinthians 7, he was free to marry in the situation that developed. Of course, but what Jesus is saying, let's not look at the mess we've made of these things. Let's go back to what God's plan is, because that's what our goal should be, to live in the way that God planned for things to happen. All the apostles, except Paul and Barnabas, were married, and their wives were a great help to them in their ministry, supporting them in their service for Christ. The only restriction in the New Testament is that a believer should always marry another believer, that together they can serve Christ. But if your spouse is not a believer, and you are, you should seek to live together in peace, and God will bless your marriage.